A kettle rattled dry on the stove while Jonah Hale scraped frost from the inside of his own window, as if the cold had claimed the house from within. He didn't hurry. Nothing inside was worth saving from it. Outside, a shape lay half-buried against the woodpile, dark braid, unmoving. He nearly turned away. Then she stirred, eyes sharp despite the cold. "Don't," she rasped when he reached to lift her. "You already saved me once." He frowned. He'd never seen her before, but somehow she was looking at him like she knew exactly what he'd lost. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The kettle had long since given up its last whisper of heat, but Jonah Hale let it sit anyway, metal ticking faintly as it cooled. Frost had crept across the inside of the window in delicate white veins, turning the outside world into something distant and unreachable. He scraped at it with the edge of a dull knife, not to see beyond it, but simply to feel something give under his hand. The cold had settled into the house weeks ago. Not the kind that came from weather, but the kind that stayed even when the fire was fed. It lingered in the corners, in the empty chair by the table, in the second cup he still set out without thinking. He had stopped asking himself why he did it. A faint sound reached him, something soft, almost lost beneath the wind brushing along the walls. Jonah stilled. At first he thought it was the woodpile shifting. The snow had been heavy this season, pressing everything into silence. But then it came again, a shallow scrape, like breath dragged across frozen ground. He stepped outside without grabbing his coat. The air cut sharp across his face, clean and biting. The yard lay pale under the morning light, untouched except for one dark shape collapsed near the stacked wood. A braid black against the snow, a shoulder half buried. Still, Jonah stood there longer than he should have. He had learned over the past years that not everything needed saving. Some things came too late. Some things were meant to be left where they fell. But then the shape moved. Barely, just enough. He swore under his breath and crossed the yard, boots breaking through the crust of snow. When he reached her, he saw the signs clearer. Apache markings faint along her throat, skin pale beneath the cold, breath shallow but stubborn. He crouched, reaching down. "Don't," she rasped. The word was thin, but it carried. Jonah paused, hand hovering. "You already saved me once," she said, her eyes opening just enough to find his face. He frowned. There was no recognition in him to match what was in her gaze. "No memory, no trace. Don't know you," he said quietly. She almost smiled. It was a strange thing, soft, knowing even in that state. "I know," she murmured. Then her strength gave out. Jonah exhaled, slow and heavy, before lifting her anyway. He set her near the stove, wrapped in the only spare blanket that still held warmth. The fire took time to catch. He worked it carefully, steady hands building flame from stubborn coals until the room began to breathe again. She didn't wake. Jonah moved through the house the way he always did, methodical, quiet, without wasted motion. He melted snow for water, set a pot to heat, checked the door latch, though no one ever came this far out. Every so often he glanced at her, not with worry. Not quite, more like attention. By midday she stirred. Her eyes opened sharper this time, taking in the room, the fire, him standing a few paces away. "You stayed," she said, voice still rough but stronger. Jonah leaned back against the table. "My house," he replied. She pushed herself up slightly, wincing. "Then I suppose I'm the one who stayed." He didn't answer that. She studied him a moment longer, something thoughtful settling in her expression. "You pull a man from a river last spring," she said slowly. "You don't expect the river to remember you, but it does." Jonah's brow tightened. "I don't fish rivers." No, she said. You dragged him out anyway. He said nothing. After a moment, she let her head rest back again. My brother, she added, he told me. Jonah looked toward the fire, jaw set. I didn't know it was you, she said. Not until now. That don't matter, he said. It matters to me. He shrugged once, dismissive, though not harsh. Then you're done here. When you're steady, you can go. Her gaze softened, but she didn't argue, not yet. By the second day, she could stand. By the third, she was moving through the house like she had some right to the space, not boldly, but with a quiet intention that unsettled him more than any noise would have. Jonah came in from splitting wood to find the table cleared, the second cup gone. He stopped in the doorway. She stood by the stove, sleeves rolled slightly, stirring something simple but warm. You don't eat enough, she said without turning. I eat. Not properly. He stepped inside, setting the axe aside. Didn't ask for help. No, she agreed, but I needed to be useful. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair. They ate in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, just unfamiliar. Afterward, she gathered the dishes, and when he reached to take them, her hand brushed his. A small thing, but Jonah pulled back like he'd touched flame. She noticed. Of course she did, but she didn't comment, just carried on, steady and unbothered. That unsettled him more. Word reached town faster than Jonah expected. It was Ezra Cole who came riding up late one afternoon, boots thudding heavy against the porch as he knocked without waiting. Jonah opened the door a crack. You're loud. Ezra grinned. You've got company. Figured I'd see it for myself. Go home. The door widened before Jonah could close it again. She stood there, calm as ever. You must be his friend. Ezra blinked, caught off guard, then tipped his hat slightly. Something like that. Jonah sighed. She needs a place in town, Jonah said, when she's ready. Ezra glanced between them, and until then. She stays. It sounded more final than Jonah intended. Ezra's grin softened. Well, I'll be. Days began to settle into a rhythm neither of them spoke about. She woke earlier than him sometimes, coaxing the fire back to life before the cold could claim the room again. He found small changes, cleaned corners, mended cloth, a piece of dried herb hung near the stove for scent. Nothing dramatic, just presence. They worked around each other at first, careful not to cross paths too closely, but the house was not large enough to hold distance forever. One morning, he found her outside, struggling to carry a small bundle of wood. You'll slip, he said. I won't. And she slipped. He caught her before she hit the ground, one arm steady around her shoulders. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her breath hitched, more from surprise than fear. Jonah's grip tightened instinctively, then loosened just as quickly. You're stubborn, he muttered. She smiled, a little breathless. So I've been told. He let her go, but the space between them felt different afterward. In town, things shifted too. Jonah hadn't walked those streets in months without purpose. Now he found himself doing it with her beside him, her gaze curious, absorbing everything with a quiet wonder that made the familiar seem less worn. At the general store, she lingered over simple things, fabric, thread, small tools. Jonah paid without comment. You don't have to, she started. I know, he said. She studied him, then nodded once. That night, she used the fabric to patch a tear in his coat he hadn't noticed. He didn't thank her, but he wore it the next morning. The laughter came without warning, A small thing, a spilled cup, her trying to catch it too late, the way she looked at the mess like it had personally betrayed her. Jonah let out a short breath, then another. It wasn't much, barely a sound, but it was real. She stilled, watching him carefully, as if afraid the moment might break. "You should do that more," she said softly. He looked away. "Don't make it a habit." But the corners of his mouth didn't fully settle back. The nights grew quieter, not empty, just full in a different way. They would sit near the stove, the lamp low, her hands busy with some small task while he worked leather or simply rested. Sometimes they spoke, not about anything heavy, not at first, small things, the weather, the way the town changed with seasons, a story about her brother told in pieces, until one night she asked, "Who did you lose?" Jonah's hands stilled, the room seemed to hold its breath. He didn't answer right away. "Don't have to tell me," she added. He shook his head slowly. "Wife," he said, "and a boy." Her hands tightened around the cloth she held. "I stayed after," he continued, voice even. "Didn't see a reason to leave, didn't see much reason for anything, really." She didn't interrupt. "I thought if I kept things the same," he went on, "it'd mean something. Like I wasn't letting it go." His gaze dropped, but it just got quiet. She set her work aside. "Loving again doesn't erase them," she said gently. He let out a breath that felt heavier than any he'd taken in years. "Feels like it would." "It doesn't," she said. "It just makes the living worth staying for." He kept his distance after that. Not cold, not unkind, just careful, too careful, she noticed. Of course she did, but she didn't push. Instead, she stayed, made the house warmer, made the days lighter, gave him reasons to notice things again, until one evening he found her standing by the window watching the frost begin to creep back along the edges. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. She turned slightly. "I can, if that's what you want." He took a step closer. "I don't know what I want," he admitted. That was new, saying it aloud. She nodded, understanding more than he expected. "But I know what I'm afraid of," he added. She waited. "I'm afraid I'll lose it again," he said quietly. "Lose you, and I don't think I could carry that twice." She stepped closer, not touching him, but near enough that he could feel her warmth. "You're not choosing between loss and safety," she said. "You're choosing between living and not." He looked at her then, really looked. "I don't want to leave," she added softly. Something in his chest shifted. Not sharp, not painful, just opening. The next morning, the frost on the window didn't reach as far. Jonah stood there, knife in hand, then set it down without scraping. Behind him, she moved through the kitchen, humming something low and unfamiliar. The second cup sat on the table again, but this time it wasn't untouched. He picked it up, carried it over, and handed it to her. She took it, a small smile forming, and when he leaned down, pressing a careful, certain kiss to her lips, there was no hesitation left in it. The house felt different, not because the cold was gone, but because it no longer mattered. And for the first time in years, Jonah Hale chose to stay, not out of memory, but out of something still growing, something alive. The weather eased by degrees after that first hard stretch of winter, though the country around Jonah Hale's cabin remained white and stern enough to humble a man. Snow still lay deep beneath the pines, and every morning began with smoke rising slow from the chimney and the careful business of keeping warmth where warmth had no mind to stay. Yet inside the house, the season had begun to change before the land did. Nita moved through the rooms with the quiet purpose of someone who had lived too long at the mercy of weather, men, and chance, and had no intention of being helpless again. She did not ask Jonah how things ought to be done. She watched once, sometimes twice, and then found her own way. By the end of a week, the stovewood was stacked by size instead of in rough heaps. The coffee tin had been moved to the shelf where cold hands could reach it quickest in the morning, and the broken latch on the pantry door had been repaired with a strip of leather and 2 small nails she somehow found in the shed before Jonah did. He noticed every change. He said little about them. One morning he came in from feeding the mule and stopped at the sight of her kneeling near the back step, sleeves pushed up, a bucket at her side. She had taken apart the old harness that had gone stiff from neglect and was cleaning the buckles one by one, her braid hanging over her shoulder like a dark rope. "You'll freeze your hands doing that out there," he said. Without looking up, she answered, "Then I'll finish before they do." He stood a moment with the snow melting off his boots. "That harness ain't been worth much in years." Nita held up one of the buckles, now catching a pale stripe of morning light. "It will be if it's needed." Jonah looked at it, then at her. "You planning to run my place now?" At that she glanced up, and there was the beginning of mischief in her face. "No, I'm only trying to rescue it from your standards." A sound escaped him before he could stop it, not quite laughter, close enough that both of them heard it. Nita returned to her work with a look that gave nothing away, but her mouth held a secret smile the rest of the morning. She did not remain only in the cabin. When the roads became passable enough for a wagon, and the sky quit threatening snow every hour, she rode into town with Jonah on a supply run. He had expected her to keep close and silent, wary of curious eyes. Instead, she met the town as if she had already decided not to be ashamed of needing a place in it. At Mercer's store, she thanked old Mrs. Mercer for the wool she handed over and asked after the woman's swollen wrist in the same breath, noticing the way she held one hand stiff. At the blacksmith's, she paused to watch a shoeing and asked a question so practical the smith blinked before answering. By the time Jonah finished loading flour and lamp oil, 2 women had spoken to her and a third had invited her to come by the church sewing circle, though Nita only smiled and said she preferred work that mended things used by living hands. Jonah watched all of it with a quiet unease he did not care to name. It was not jealousy, not exactly. It was the strange feeling of seeing something rare take root in hard ground and realizing the ground had not refused it. A few days later, Ezra Cole came by with a sack of feed balanced over one shoulder and a grin already formed before he reached the porch. "I hear your guest shamed Mercer into fixing his own front sign," he said. Jonah took the sack from him. "Did she?" Ezra leaned past him, peering toward the kitchen. "That true?" Nita looked up from the table where she was trimming cloth into neat strips. "No," she said. "I only asked why a man would leave a sign hanging crooked when everyone in town must look at it." Ezra barked a laugh. "That do it." Jonah shook his head and carried the feed to the shed, but he could hear them talking behind him. Ezra amused, Nita calm, each measuring the other and finding no offense. When he came back, Ezra was seated at the table, accepting coffee as if the house had always offered such things. "You've gone soft," Ezra told Jonah. "I've gone nowhere." "Could have fooled me." Ezra took a sip and nodded toward Nita. "Folks are asking if she'll help at the schoolhouse 2 afternoons a week. Teacher says half the little ones would rather listen to her than to sums." Nita looked almost embarrassed. They only wanted stories while the teacher mended a stove pipe. "Stories are a kind of work," Ezra said. especially in a place where winter drags. Jonah set a hand on the back of his chair, but did not sit. You aiming to recruit her for the whole town? Ezra's eyes flicked to him, quick and knowing. No, just observing she don't belong to the snowbank you found her in. It was lightly said, but it struck deeper than Jonah liked. That evening he noticed the strip of cloth she had been cutting laid out beside the hearth, braided into bright cords for tying kindling. A small thing, useful, finished well, like all the tasks she touched. The days found their own order after that. Nita began going to town twice a week, sometimes with Jonah, sometimes with Mrs. Mercer's nephew if he was passing the cabin road with a wagon. She helped mend shirts at the boarding house when someone's hands were too cracked for sewing. She sat with a widow named Clara who had taken ill and left with a basket of eggs pressed into her arms. She showed the blacksmith's youngest girl how to bind a split doll head with twine and paste until the child hugged the poor repaired thing as though it had been brought back from the grave. She was becoming known. Worse than that, she was becoming needed. Jonah discovered this in all the ways a man discovers what has slipped beyond his keeping. By hearing other people speak her name with ease, by seeing her return home later than before because someone had asked a favor, by realizing that when she smiled at the thought of town, something in him tightened. He did not like that tightening. He liked even less what it revealed. One afternoon he came in from the barn and found her standing on a chair, reaching for the high shelf above the stove where he kept a jar of dried apples. Her fingertips brushed the edge but could not quite hook it. "What are you doing?" "Stealing your better provisions," she said, still reaching. "You hide them too high." Before she could answer his next remark, the chair gave a small, treacherous tilt on the worn floorboard beneath it. Jonah crossed the room in 2 strides and caught her around the waist as she slipped. The chair clattered sideways. For a heartbeat she was weightless against him, one hand gripping his shoulder, the other pressed flat to his chest. He smelled wool, smoke, and the faint, clean scent of cold air in her hair. Her face was close enough that he could see the dark ring around her iris and the little scar near her chin he had never noticed before. Neither of them spoke. The fire cracked once in the stove. Nita's breath slowed. Jonah's did not. Then awareness landed hard between them. He set her back on her feet too carefully, as if she might break, and stepped away as though the distance itself were a duty. "I could have managed," she said, though her voice had gone quieter. "No," he answered. His tone stopped there, so did the moment. He picked up the chair, put it upright, reached for the jar himself, and left it on the table without meeting her eyes. Then he went outside on the excuse of checking the stock, though the stock had been checked an hour earlier. He stayed out until dusk numbed his face and reasoned nothing. That night, he sat at the table long after Nita had gone to her room. The lamp burned low. His hand rested around a cup gone cold. He looked at the door she had closed behind her and felt a restless shame that made no sense unless he spoke the truth of it. He wanted her there, not merely in the house, not merely safe. There, the thought landed like a stone in deep water, disappearing at once and disturbing everything beneath the surface. He had loved once with his whole heart and buried that life under frozen ground. He had built the years after as a narrow path a man could walk without looking left or right. Work, silence, habit, breath, nothing more. It had seemed honorable in a stubborn sort of way to remain faithful to sorrow, to refuse himself whatever comfort might make memory blur, but memory had not sharpened him. It had only emptied him. And now here was this woman who straightened his shelves, argued with his neglect, laughed without asking permission, and made him aware of the sound of another cup being set on the table. The house had changed because she lived inside it, and some treacherous part of him had changed too. He did not sleep much. A day later, the weather turned wet and grey. Snow began to loosen from the roof in heavy slumps, and the path to the barn became a ribbon of mud over ice. Nita was bringing in a basket of washing when her foot slid at the threshold. She caught the frame, but the basket tipped and sent damp shirts and one of Jonah's long johns skidding half across the porch. She stared at the underclothes with such offended dignity that Jonah, who had just rounded the corner with a bundle of split pine, stopped dead. Nita looked at him, then at the long johns, then back at him. "These," she said very gravely, "are too large to belong to any civilized man." Jonah set the wood down and, against all sense, laughed outright. The sound startled both of them. It came rough from disuse, but it came, full enough that he had to bend his head once and catch his breath. Nita watched him as if she had just seen a sunrise arrive in the wrong season. "Well," she said after a moment, "I'm glad one of us is enjoying this." He stepped onto the porch, gathered the fallen clothes, and handed her the basket. Their fingers touched briefly on the handle. Neither moved away at once. "You should have let me carry that," he said, still smiling faintly. "You say that after the disaster, not before." "That's because you don't listen before." She shook her head, but her eyes were warm. The humor lingered between them through supper and beyond it, turning the evening gentle. Yet gentleness had a way of bringing danger with it. Not danger from outside, the more difficult kind, the kind that asked a man to hope. By the week's end, Jonah had become sharp-edged again, not with her, around her. He answered kindly enough but shorter than before. He took longer chores, rode to the far pasture twice in one day, left the house before dawn once, and came back after dark, soaked by sleet and looking as if he had been fighting weather on purpose. Nita said nothing until Ezra arrived the next afternoon with a length of fencing chain and the good sense to see that Jonah's silence was the real object in need of repair. They worked by the corral first, side by side, windless under a low sky. Ezra kept his voice on simple matters for a while: posts, soil, the thaw. Then he said, "You planning to sulk yourself into the grave over a woman who makes decent coffee?" Jonah kept pulling the chain through a staple. "Mind your own business." "I was, you made it tiresome." Jonah straightened, gloved hands braced on the fence rail. Ezra waited, patient in the infuriating way of old friends. "She's leaving one day," Jonah said at last. Ezra nodded. "Maybe, most folks do leave somewhere." Jonah broke off, jaw tight. "I won't build my life around something I'll bury." Ezra's face lost its humor. "You're not afraid she'll leave. You're afraid you'll love her before she does." Jonah looked away toward the tree line, where slush dripped steadily from the branches. "For years," Ezra said more quietly, "I figured you staying half dead was your way of honoring Mary and the boy. But it ain't honor anymore, Jonah. It's habit, bitter habit." The name of his wife, spoken plain in the open air, struck him harder than the cold had. Ezra went on, "You think the dead ask that of us, to sit in dark rooms and call it devotion?" Jonah swallowed once, hard. "You weren't there when I lost them." "No," Ezra said, "but I've been here while you lost yourself." They finished the fence in silence. That night Nita found Jonah in the barn, seated on an upturned crate with a lantern at his boots and an old cedar box open on his knees. She might have turned back if he had looked angry. Instead, he looked tired in a way that made anger seem too heavy to carry. He did not ask why she had come. She did not ask what was in the box. There was a small knitted cap folded atop a strip of faded blue ribbon. Beneath it, a woman's comb with 2 missing teeth. Nita stood in the doorway a long time before stepping closer. "Your son?" she asked softly. Jonah nodded. "And your wife?" Another nod. His hand hovered over the ribbon but did not touch it. "I kept thinking if I guarded every piece of them, nothing would fade." He let out a breath that caught halfway. "But I forgot the sound of her singing before I forgot anything else. Ain't that a cruel thing?" Nita came to stand beside him, close, not pressing, only there. "It's cruel," she said. "That time keeps moving when we want it to kneel." He bowed his head. For a while the barn held only the small noises of animals shifting in their stalls and thaw water dripping from the eaves. Then Jonah spoke again, his voice thin with something he had kept packed down too long. "I was supposed to keep them safe." The words broke on the last one. Nita crouched in front of him, so he had no choice but to see her. No man keeps death outside forever. "I should have done more. You were humans." He shut his eyes. His shoulders, always held like a gate barred against weather, finally gave. The grief did not strike him like a shout. It came slower, deeper, dragging years with it. He bent forward with both hands over his face and grieved the way a man grieves only when he has gone too long pretending not to. Nita did not speak again for some time. She only laid one hand over his clenched fist and left it there, steady as a promise. When at last his breathing evened, he lowered his hands. His eyes were red, his expression raw, stripped down to the honest thing beneath all his silence. "I don't know how to want another life," he said. Nita's own eyes shone, but her voice stayed calm. "You already do, that's what hurts." He looked at her then, fully, with no room left for hiding. "And I'm afraid," he admitted. "Afraid if I love you, I betray them. Afraid if I love you, I lose you. Afraid of both at once." Nita's hand tightened gently over his. "Love does not steal from the dead," she said. "It's the only thing grief leaves us still able to give." He took that in like water after drought, slowly, painfully. Outside, somewhere beyond the barn, a single drop fell from the roof, then another. The thaw was finally winning. Jonah drew a shaky breath and covered her hand with his own. For the first time since she had come into his life, he did not pull away. The days after Jonah Hale's breakdown in the barn did not turn suddenly easy. Grief did not vanish simply because it had finally been named aloud, and love did not step neatly into the place that sorrow had occupied. But something essential had shifted. The silence between Jonah and Nita no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a crossing. Even so, Jonah grew careful in a different way. He did not withdraw into coldness as he had before. He did not take refuge in unnecessary work or disappear into the far pasture until dark. Instead, he became gentler and more uncertain, as if every ordinary moment now carried a weight he did not trust himself to lift too quickly. He watched her more, not openly. Not enough to embarrass her, but Nita felt it all the same. He noticed when she came in from town flushed from the wind, her arms full of mending and a paper-wrapped packet of cinnamon Mrs. Mercer had insisted she take. He noticed when she laughed at something Ezra said and then glanced toward Jonah as if some part of her wanted to know whether he would laugh too. He noticed how naturally she belonged now to the house, to the road between cabin and town, to the little circle of people who had begun to speak of her as though she had always been part of the valley. That should have comforted him. Instead, it stirred a new unease. Not because he feared she would leave that instant, but because he had begun to understand that if she did, the place she left behind in him would be deeper than the one she had found. One afternoon, she returned from Clara's house with a basket of eggs and a basket of talk, most of it relayed with dry amusement, while Jonah pared kindling by the stove. Clara says Mrs. Mercer is pretending not to notice that Ezra combs his hair on days he expects to be seen, Nita said. Jonah snorted softly. And the school teacher says little Ben Carter refuses to practice his letters unless someone tells him a story first. That boy would bargain with the devil for less work. Nita smiled. I told him that was a useful skill if he meant to grow into a rancher. Jonah looked up at her then, and there was something in his expression that quieted the room, not sadness, not even longing exactly, just a warmth so steady it felt almost solemn. Nita set the eggs on the table. What is it? He shook his head once, like a man coming back from farther off than he intended to go. Nothing. But it was not nothing. It was the sight of life gathering around her. The sight of his home receiving it, the dangerous understanding that the house did not merely feel less empty now, it felt possible. That was what frightened him, because possibility demanded an answer. As March loosened winter's grip, snow receded from the south-facing slopes and the creek began muttering again beneath its cracked ice. Mud replaced the hard white silence. The smell of wet earth came back. Jonah repaired fence lines. Nita turned over the small garden patch near the side of the house with a stubbornness that made him shake his head, though he found himself bringing her the better spade without being asked. In the evenings, they sat together more easily than before. She sewed by lamplight. He planed cedar boards for a new shelf. Sometimes one of them spoke. Sometimes neither did. The quiet had changed so much that Jonah scarcely recognized it as kin to the silence that had ruled the cabin before she came. Yet the nearer he drew to saying what lived inside him, the more he hesitated. He knew now what he felt. That was no longer the question. The question was whether a man who had spent years treating memory like a grave he must never step away from could truly ask for another future without faltering beneath the guilt of it. He began to imagine speaking to her and then stopped himself every time. At the water bucket, at the porch steps, across the supper table while she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The words rose and failed, until he became impatient with his own caution. Nita felt that too. She answered his kindness with kindness, but she grew quieter in her own way, as though she sensed that some turning point stood just ahead and did not wish to crowd it. There were moments when he would catch her looking at him across the room with a softness that almost undid him, only for her to lower her eyes and continue with whatever task lay in her hands. The distance between them was no longer made of doubt. It was made of waiting. One Saturday, the town held its first proper market day since the thaw began. Wagons lined the main road. Chickens complained from crates. Children chased one another around barrels and got themselves called back by mothers too busy buying flour to truly be angry. Nita went early to help Clara with a stand of preserves and sewing. Jonah arrived later with 2 sacks of feed and every intention of keeping his errands brief. That plan lasted until he saw her. She stood beneath the awning outside Mercer's store, sleeves rolled, speaking to Mrs. Mercer and the school teacher while a little girl clung to her skirt and held up a rag doll wearing one new blue patch across its chest. Nita bent to fix the doll's crooked bonnet, and the child beamed as if receiving attention from a queen. Jonah stopped in the middle of the road. It was not beauty alone that struck him, though she had that in a way no town finery could improve. It was the expression on her face, open, amused, attentive, wholly alive. The sort of face that made people feel steadier simply by being seen by it. Ezra came up beside him, carrying a sack of seed corn. "There's the look of a doomed man." Jonah did not bother denying it. Ezra followed his gaze and nodded. "You planning to tell her before the whole county does it for you?" Jonah exhaled through his nose. "Mind your load." "I am minding it better than you're minding your life." Jonah took the bait only enough to glance at him. "You always this helpful." When needed, Ezra shifted the sack on his shoulder. "And you, Jonah Hale, are badly in need." Nita turned just then and spotted them. Her face changed at once, brightening not for the crowd, but for him. The sight of that unguarded welcome hit Jonah harder than any speech could have. She crossed toward them with the little girl still attached to her hand. "Mrs. Mercer says I am now responsible for 3 jars of peach preserves, because Clara sold out before noon, and everyone took that as an insult." Ezra nodded gravely. "Town gets reckless after winter." The child peered up at Jonah from behind Nita's skirt. "She fixed Matilda," the girl announced, thrusting forward the doll. Jonah examined the doll with the solemn respect due such matters. "Looks improved." "It's because she lessons," the girl said. "Grown folks usually don't." Nita laughed. Ezra nearly choked on his own grin. Even Jonah felt a smile move through him. The child scampered off the instant her mother called, leaving the 3 of them in a pocket of sunlight and marketplace noise. Ezra lifted his sack again. "I'm going before I'm recruited into more honesty than I care to provide." He tipped his hat to Nita and murmured, low enough for only Jonah to hear, "Don't waste spring." Then he was gone. Nita watched him go with narrowed amusement. "That man speaks like he knows everyone's business." "He mostly does." "And yours." Jonah looked at her. "More than I like." Something in his tone must have reached her because her smile softened. Neither moved for a beat. Around them, market day rolled on with all its clatter and ordinary bustle, but the stillness between them felt private. "Walk with me when you're finished?" he asked. Her answer was simple, yes. All afternoon, the promise of that walk followed him like a second pulse. He loaded feed, traded for seed potatoes, listened to half of what the blacksmith said about spring runoff, and retained none of it. When at last the sun tilted westward and the crowd began thinning, he found Nita by the stand, tying up the cloth cover over Clara's last basket. They left town on foot, leading the mule behind them to spare it the extra ride over churned roads. The sky had turned that pale gold peculiar to early spring, when light seems almost shy after months of snow glare. Water ran along the roadside in thin, quick channels. Somewhere in the brush, a meadowlark tried out the first few notes of the season. For a while they spoke of easy things. Clara's preserves, Mrs. Mercer's opinion that men never properly dried boots, the way Ben Carter had attempted to purchase a pocketknife with 2 buttons and a marble. Jonah listened, smiled where he could, and felt each ordinary word bringing him nearer to something he could no longer put off. When they reached the rise above the creek, he stopped. Nita turned to him, reading the change before he said a word. The mule lowered its head to snatch at the first green shoots near the ditch. Water moved below them, brown and restless from melt. The valley stretched beyond, patched with wet fields and lingering snow, the cabin roof barely visible among the trees. Jonah took off his hat and held it in both hands. It gave him something to do with them. "I've been trying to find the right way to say what's in me," he began. "Turns out a man can think too long and make a knot of even honest things." Nita stood very still, but her eyes did not leave his face. "When I found you by the woodpile, I thought you were trouble sent by winter." A faint, crooked breath passed through him that almost counted as humor. "Maybe you were." Her mouth curved slightly. "I was half frozen. That does complicate a first impression." He nodded, then grew serious again. "Before you came, that house was only a place I stayed alive in. That's all. I worked. I slept. I remembered. I called it a life because I had no better word for it." The breeze shifted the loose hair at her temple. She made no move to interrupt. "You didn't force anything," Jonah went on. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. You didn't demand I change. You just lived near me, brought warmth where there wasn't any, set things right that I'd left broken, talked to people I'd shut out, made a place for yourself without taking anything from what came before." His voice roughened slightly. "I laughed again because of you, ate better because of you, opened doors I'd nailed shut in my own head because you stood there patient enough to wait for me to see them." Nita's eyes shone now, but she held steady. Jonah looked down at the hat in his hands, then back at her. "I loved my wife. I loved my boy. That won't stop being true the day I die." "It shouldn't," she said softly. "No," he swallowed, "but loving you is true too." The words hung in the spring air, plain and without decoration. He took one slow breath. "I'm still afraid. Afraid because I know what loss costs. Afraid because wanting a future again feels like stepping onto ground I don't trust. But I'd rather be frightened with the truth than safe in the lie I've been living." For a moment Nita said nothing. Tears had gathered in her eyes, but they did not fall. When she spoke, her voice carried warmth, and something stronger than warmth beneath it. "Jonah Hale," she said, "you have spent so long treating your heart like a graveyard that you forgot it was also meant to be a home." He closed his eyes once, just briefly, at the tenderness of that. She stepped closer. "You never dishonored the dead by surviving, and you do not dishonor them now by loving what is still in front of you." Her expression softened. "I have known men who wanted to save me because it made them feel noble. You were never that man. You gave me shelter when I had none. You gave me room to be useful, to be myself, to become more than the woman you found in the snow. You listened, even when silence was easier. And every day since, you have shown me kindness that asks for nothing in return." Her hand rose, hesitant only until it reached his sleeve. "I love you too, not because you rescued me once or twice, or because this valley feels less lonely with your name in it. I love you because you are a good man who kept living even when life seemed to have done its worst to you, and because beneath all that sorrow, you never stopped being gentle." Jonah did not realize he had stepped toward her until there was no distance left worth measuring. He touched her face with the back of his fingers first, almost reverent, as if asking one last unspoken question. Nita answered by leaning into his hand. The kiss that followed was quiet and sure. No rush, no drama, no fever of desperation. Just the deep relief of two people finally stepping where their hearts had already gone. His hand settled at her waist. Hers came to rest against his chest. The world around them continued exactly as before, water running, mule cropping grass, a bird calling from the brush, but something immense and inward had changed. When they parted, Jonah let his forehead rest briefly against hers. "I should have said it sooner," he murmured. Nita smiled through the tears she had finally let fall. "Yes, but I've found you worth waiting for." He laughed softly at that, and the sound held none of the strain it once had. The weeks that followed did not need grand declarations. Their happiness grew in work, in habit, in the way real lives do. Spring settled in earnest. Jonah repaired the porch and built the shelf he had promised months before. Nita planted beans, onions, and squash in the small patch beside the house, and insisted that if he expected to eat from it, he could not trample the rows with his large, thoughtless boots. He obeyed poorly enough to be corrected twice, and well enough to enjoy being corrected. She moved her few belongings fully into his room without ceremony, and the cabin accepted the change as if it had always been waiting for it. Her shawl hung by the door beside his coat. Her comb rested near the wash basin. A second lamp appeared on the bedside table. The home no longer looked arranged around absence. It looked lived in. Town noticed, of course. Mrs. Mercer noticed first, and with the least subtlety. She sent over a loaf of brown bread for a house that finally remembers it has a kitchen. Clara came with a clutch of fresh chicks and the opinion that every proper place required useless creatures to keep it lively. Ezra merely stood on the porch one evening, looked from Jonah to Nita and back again, and said, "About time," before accepting coffee like a man who had personally engineered the whole affair. By midsummer, Jonah had asked Nita to marry him. He did it at the table after supper, with daylight still lingering at the window and the smell of sage drifting in through the screen door. No kneeling, no flourish. He simply reached across the table, took her hand, and said, with the plainness that belonged to him, "I want every season I've got left to be shared with you. Will you have me for them?" Nita looked at him for a long moment, smiling the way a person smiles at both joy and mercy together. "Yes," she said, "I will." They married in the valley on a warm September afternoon when the cottonwoods had just begun to pale. Clara cried first. Mrs. Mercer cried second, but claimed dust in her eye. Ezra stood with Jonah and looked unreasonably proud for a man who had done nothing but interfere. The schoolchildren scattered late wildflowers across the path, and little Ben Carter insisted on presenting Nita with a crooked garland he had made himself, and which looked more like a net for catching trout than anything fit for a bride. She wore a simple dress the color of cream. Jonah wore the coat she had patched back in winter, though it had been brushed and pressed to within an inch of dignity. When they spoke their vows, neither used many words. They did not need many. Everyone there understood that what stood between them had already been tested by silence, sorrow, patience, and daily bread. Marriage did not transform them into different people. It let them become more fully themselves. The cabin changed gradually over the next years. Jonah added a larger front window to catch morning light. Nita planted hollyhocks along the fence and laughed when the hens scratched too near them. A rocker appeared on the porch, then another. Shelves filled. The garden widened. Smoke from the chimney began to mean not merely survival, but supper and company and the end of honest work. Children came too, though not quickly enough for either of them to presume upon joy. The first was a daughter with Jonah's steady eyes and Nita's stubborn mouths. The second was a boy who laughed easily and once tried to feed pebbles to the mule. The house that had once held only grief learned the sounds of small boots, spilled milk, bedtime songs, and questions asked at the exact moment a man sat down to rest. Jonah kept the cedar box still. but it no longer lived hidden in the barn. It sat on a high shelf in the bedroom, treated not as a wound that must be guarded from touch, but as part of the family's story. When the children were old enough, he told them about Mary and the little brother who came before them. He did not speak with the shattered voice of a man trapped in loss. He spoke with tenderness and with the peace of someone who had learned that memory and new love need not be enemies. On winter mornings, years after the day he found Nita in the snow, Jonah would sometimes stand by that same window with a cup warming his hands. Frost still came. Seasons still did what seasons pleased, but the house was never cold in the old way again. One such morning, he turned from the glass to find the room full of the life he had once believed was closed to him forever. Nita stood by the stove, older now, no less beautiful, her braid touched with silver where lamplight found it. Their daughter sat at the table teaching the younger boy his letters with all the severity of an 8-year-old schoolmarm. The kettle sang, bread baked. Someone laughed. Jonah crossed the room and set a hand at the small of Nita's back as he passed. She tipped her head toward him. What? He looked around once, letting his gaze rest on each face, each ordinary miracle. Nothing, he said, though his voice carried the full weight of gratitude. Then he bent and kissed her temple, only saving what's worth saving. And this time, when he looked out at the winter beyond the window, it no longer seemed like a claim laid against the house. It looked instead like weather passing over a home strong enough to hold. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So, till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.